Welcome to another week of Watercolours with Caroline. It's November here in Canada, and we are painting Farm Fair this season. So I have chosen a photo by Denise McQuillan from the Facebook group Free Reference Photos for Artists, and a beautiful barn in the Grand Teton Park, a very famous barn called the T.A. Moulton Barn. And we're going to have a go at painting it today. Now, it's probably better if you have a bit bigger piece of paper today, sort of 6x8 or 8x10, so that you can really get the detail in. It's quite a long project. The mountains are a bit tricky, but let's see how we do. Get your paints and your paper, and we'll get going. Okay, so I've got here the photo of the barn by Denise McQuillan, and you can find this what was, did I say? It was the T something Moulton Barn in Grand Teton. You can find pictures of it all over the internet. It's very, very famous. But I really like this one by Denise McQuillan that I found because it's a free one for use, and my interpretation of it. So if you, and as like I was saying to Carolyn, if you don't have the colors that I've specified, we can find a substitute. There's no problem with that. And I know I use mostly Gamboge down here, but I'm looking at this really light color. I must have diluted it right down because it looks really, really light. I couldn't even believe this morning that I didn't use some raw sienna or something there. I don't know what I did, but you know, if you don't have Gamboge, you just use some yellow, some raw sienna, whatever you want to use, it'll come out just fine. But we're going to start with the sky. And we're going to keep the sky pretty simple. Now, there's a lot of cloud coming down over the mountain here. We're going to avoid a little bit of that. We don't want to do too much of that, I don't think, because it gets really tricky with the wet and wet. Well, maybe just attempt it, just sort of here and see. So it's going to be very basic sky. We're going to just wet the sky and use cerulean blue. And if you don't have cerulean blue, you can dilute phthalo blue and use that. And if you don't have either of those, cobalt blue will work. But the cerulean is definitely the best. So let's get my paper off to one side. And I'm going to use my number 8 brush because the sky's not very big. Get my camera so it doesn't keep going out of focus. It doesn't always behave itself. Right, so I'm going to actually turn my page so that I can run my paintbrush down the edge of those mountains and not go over the edge, because I want them to have a nice crisp edge when I come to do the mountains here. And the good thing is, by just wetting this area, we can work on everything else dry paper. We don't have to wait for the sky to dry or anything like that. And I usually wet before I mix my color up, because it gives it time, it gives the water time to soak into the paper, and it means my water is nice and clean and my brush is nice and clean. I don't have any paint contaminating it. And then I always like to just tip. Oh, I've got some dry spots, so it's good to tip your paper and check. Can see 2 dry spots there. Oh, and dry spots here. Drying pretty quickly today. Go back over those and make sure that it's wet. Now, you don't want the water running off of it, but you do want to make sure that every little piece is wet. And again, I'm going to grab my Kleenex and just make sure that the edge doesn't have water that's going to run back into the sky. And let's get my paints and a little bit of water on the palette and then some cerulean blue. Now, don't make the cerulean blue too wet, because if you do, it's going to flood out into the water and you're just going to get blue everywhere where you don't want it. The key is to make it a little bit drier than usual. You know how when I say do a wash, you need to have it tipping around? Well, you don't want this tipping around. You want it less wet, so that when you put the paint on the paper, it stays where you put it and just creeps into the cloud area slowly. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. I'm trying to get enough light on there without too much shine, which is a tricky thing to do. I don't know if that light's going to help or make it too shiny. Let's turn that off. Brighten that up a little bit. So I've just put a little bit of cerulean in the corner. I really like to get color in the corners of the picture, so that even though this corner over here doesn't have blue sky, I want to put some in there just to constrain the picture. There's a little fluffy cloud. I'm not going to try and do the clouds exactly, but I'm going to try and make an effort to just have something similar. So there's a little fluffy cloud just over there. And I'll leave a little bit of white space for that. It doesn't matter what shape you leave it. It will form its own cloud shape, just like real clouds do. And I want to get the blue at the edge of the mountains in a lot of places. There's a bit of sky that comes down into the cloud here. Now, you have to work fairly fast because you don't want your wet paper to dry up too quickly. But you can, if you've wet it properly, you've got a little bit of time to plan the shapes of your clouds. You don't have to like go wild and slap it on there really, really quickly. And if your paint is, like I say, if your paint is not mobile, if it will stay where it is, it won't go too far on your paper. This is the key, wet and wet. You can't have your paint more wet than your paper is. And then I'm going to come down here, put some blue down here. Now we're going to do, this sky is not going to have anything else done to it. I know in the photo that I have, there's a bit of gray in the clouds that Jill was talking about. We're not going to bother with that. That's too much detail for us to bother with. A little bit of blue down here. And then we're just going to let that gently blend into the white clouds all by itself. If at any point your paint has flooded into your clouds too much, you can take, you need a soft Kleenex tissue for that. You need to scrunch it up so you've got just a little corner. And if you feel like you want to pull back a little bit of cloud because you got too much, don't overdo it because it will look weird. Just, you can use your Kleenex to just gently, if you want to, just take out a little bit. Now, I really caution you to not go overboard with this, because if you get carried away dabbing out your clouds, you're going to end up with something that looks horrific. And I want a piece of spare paper to show you what I mean. I'm just looking for a piece of scrap paper here. Where's scrap paper when you need it? Now, we'll use this. Okay. Let's use this paper here. Just, I'm going to put this aside and show you what you shouldn't do. A couple of things you shouldn't do. Let's have, first of all, let's have too much water with your paint. So I'm going to do what would happen if you have too much water with your paint first. I could wet the whole thing and do both at the same time. So I'm going to mix up paint that's too wet. And this is the sort of paint that you'd mix for a wash on dry paper. It needs to be floating around. So if you put that on your wet paper, it's going to flood into your clouds too much, and you'll probably end up losing all your clouds, and your sky will be very, very faint. It might be okay on good paper, but you will struggle more than if your paint is less wet. So let's make some less wet paint. And put that down here. It's still a bit too wet, and the water hasn't had time to soak in. I can see that the water is still on the surface and floating about. You see here, I can see it actually floating, which is, it hasn't soaked in enough. But let's put the paint on anyway, because this is what not to do. So you put the paint on and it's soaked into, you've lost some of your clouds. So here's what not to do. Don't take your balled up Kleenex and shove it down like this, getting great big cotton balls and hard edges. It's not going to look as beautiful and soft as if you just take a little teeny corner of your Kleenex and just pull some little tiny bits, tiny wispy bits out of the clouds. Yes, you can have some hard edges at the tops if you want, and we can put some gray in underneath, but avoid the pushing down. And what sometimes I see people do is we have a row of identical
is a replacement for
lodges. So please try and avoid that. Don't be brutal with your Kleenex. And you can see that this area up the top where my wash was too wet going in is still too wet. We wouldn't get a nice cloud effect when the top wash is as wet as the paper underneath. It just kind of all becomes a nothing rather than having shapes. And you'll see as this starts to dry that these hard shapes are too hard. They're not soft like clouds. So just gently with a Kleenex, if you need to pick up a little bit, it's very helpful, keeping the edges nice and soft. So I'll put that to one side, make that into something later and bring this back. Now you can see mine are pretty much where I put them. They haven't gone any, the blue hasn't gone anywhere I didn't want it to go. It hasn't gone too far into the white, but it still left some nice soft edges. And it's not a good idea to use a hairdryer or anything like that, because this will continue to soak in and soften for several minutes, and it needs to do that before the paper dries. So we can work on other things on this while that's happening. Let me just check my notes to see what I worked on next. We've done the sky. So I've said we're going to wet the foreground and we're going to add a wash of Gamboge, and then straight away we're going to work some burnt sienna into the wet Gamboge, and then we're going to mix a bright green. We're going to use the azo yellow or cadmium yellow and some phthalo blue, and I'll show you where that's going to go. We're just going to add some bright green bits to the grass. That's all going to be worked wet in wet. I'm looking for my barn picture. So if you look at this one here, we have the very light yellow of the sort of sandy path. We have some areas here where there's a burnt sienna color in the dry grass, and here and there we've got that very light green tinge. So that's what we're aiming to do, and then we'll put these shadows on much later. We're also going to do a little bit more tree showing behind the barn. These are rather tiny and a bit insignificant. If they're that tiny on a photograph, you either leave it out completely or make it a bit bigger, and we're just going to make it a bit bigger. So, and we're going to do that while the sky is soaking in. So let me pull this over a little bit so people can see the mixing tray. And I've got a second pot of water that's nice and clean. So I'm going to take my yellow up to here behind my barn, and I'm going to wet all this so that will help. Now, when I get to this grass here, I'm going to go up and down with my brush so I don't get a straight line in the water there. I can get straight lines here underneath. And I want to go sort of up to here, out that side of the barn too. And then as I come along in front, this long grass, again, I'm going to go up and down with my brush. And then I'm going to tip it and check that everything is wet and dry the edge. Don't want to run back into the page. And while that's soaking in, I'm going to get my Gamboge. Now, Gamboge is just a really warm orangey yellow. If you don't have Gamboge, you can use an ordinary yellow, cadmium yellow, azo yellow, any ordinary, just, you know, basic yellow. And you can add a little bit of red to it, just a tiny bit, just to warm it up a little bit. And it's pretty much the same as Gamboge. So there's the two. Or you can just use yellow. You can just use a yellow, it'll be fine. So I have the Gamboge ready. And I don't want it too strong because I want the path very light in the front. And it will dry a lot lighter than it looks when it goes on. It can go a bit stronger as it goes towards the barn. And again, quick strokes because this is just our base layer going on here. And before that dries too much, I want to get the burnt sienna on there. So I want to get my burnt sienna, get my tray. I'm still with my number 8 brush because having a bigger brush forces you to get your paint on fairly quickly and fairly loosely without fiddling too much. Now remember, we're not working on dry paper, so I don't want my burnt sienna to move around. I want it to just stay in one place. I've already got wet paper and I have wet Gamboge paint on there. So I can't go wet with my burnt sienna. Otherwise, I've got 3 layers of wet. And I need to have my photo just so I know where I'm working. So there is quite a lot of burnt sienna over here. And I'm going to flick my brush upwards just to get that look of the dry grass. And the same over here. Just flick my brush in an upward direction. And then as I come to where it meets the path, I want to ground that with a few horizontal strokes, and then I can come back up if I need to. And over to this side, I have a glare from the lights. It's really hard to stop that happening when you've got wet paper. And try and tip it a little bit. And over in this corner a bit more. Now I'm going to put some dry burnt sienna on later. But I'm going to put a little bit of wet in wet right now. Go back and forth horizontally with those strokes. And a little bit in the distance. And a little bit along this edge by the barn. Now, I don't want it too dark along by the barn because the barn is going to be burnt sienna color. So I want some contrast between the lighter grass and the burnt sienna, and I can put a bit more on later. Now we want to get the green and have those green, just those green tinges. I'm going to switch to a 6 brush, a little bit smaller, and we need to mix up a very light green. And I used, I think I said I used Azo yellow and Phthalo blue. So Azo yellow is my really bright yellow. I use it instead of cadmium yellow. I prefer it. It's more transparent. And a little bit of Phthalo blue. And it gives me a very bright green. And I'm just going to add a tinge of that to the grass in spots. Line between my painting and my picture. A little bit here. It's pretty subtle. It's just to give, there's a little bit here, a little bit there. Just the tiniest touch. You can always put a little bit more on later if you get to the point where you think I need a little bit more green. That's okay. And then those trees behind the barn, we're going to use the bright green, and then we're going to make it a little bit darker with some ultramarine blue. Oh, let's make a little bit more of that bright green, probably more than I need, but anyway, here we go. And then I'm going to add to one side of it, I'm going to add some ultramarine blue to darken it up. Just on one side. Switch to an even smaller brush, number 4. We're going small. And I'm going to take the light green first. Quite watery because I'm working on dry paper over here. Light green first. And I've made the trees a little bit bigger. Put on the light green. Then I'm going to grab the dark green and just drop a little bit of that in, wet in wet. And I'm going to get the Gamboge, the bright yellow, and just wet in wet, just drop a little bit of that into. So I've got sort of 3 colors in those trees. I'm going to do the same over this side. The light green, they're just a little bit of tree poking up, and I've made a bit more of them than there is. Little brush, little bit of the light green, then pick up the dark green, which I added just a bit of ultramarine blue to the light green, and put a little bit close to the roof. Now the roof is almost white, so having this dark next to the roof is going to help make it stand out. And then again, I want to get a little bit of the Gamboge and just touch it to some of that tree there, show the light on the top. Now you may think, we usually use light to dark. We usually use yellow to dark. Sometimes, and especially in this instance, I find it works better to put your light yellow on last so that it kind of floods into the other greens a little easier than if you put it on first. The other greens flood into the yellow and they disappear. You can see how that yellow is really kind of flooded back into the light green. And Gamboge is quite a good one for just that dotting a little bit dark green. It's quite a good one for flooding back in and pushing the other colors back. There, we've got those in there. And I forgot something. I wonder if you know what I forgot. I forgot the windows, but it's okay. I've still got lots of cerulean blue on my palette. I'm going to take my small brush now, my little number 2. And if you see here, these window panes right here are reflecting the blue sky. And we're going to put those in with the cerulean blue, which they make a nice light place in the middle of this darkish barn. So we can put those in carefully. I'm going to just scoop a little bit of it out with my brush. And I'm going to try this window pane has got white bits. I don't know what those bits are called. No, it's not going to work. It's too tiny divisions between them. I can put those on later with white. It's too tiny for me to get the divisions in. Put that on. And we've got the cerulean blue in. And by this time, the sky is starting to dry up quite nicely. yet. Put some on later with some PH Martin's white. And we might try for a little bit of cloud on top of the mountain, but you don't have to. If that seems tricky, don't do that. Now, a lot of these places where you have patchy mountain and patchy sort of trees and shadow, we're going to use a dry brush technique for that, which means having the brush nearly dry and just kind of dragging it over the texture of the paper, especially over here, to make that sort of texture in the snow. And keep my picture handy. This is where we're going to do the most work, getting this to look like mountains. And we can work slowly, we can work on dry paper. And if you have either, you know, the picture of mine in front of you or a picture you found on the internet, you need to really pay attention to all these areas of dark and light to get this looking right. And as you're painting it, sometimes it feels a bit patchy, like some kind of a patchwork quilt. But when you pull back and then you have the dark barn in front of it, it's going to look fine. So don't worry too much. I need to mix up my colors ready for this one because I'm working on dry paper. I'm going to take my number 8 brush. I don't like to mix with a brush that's too small. And the first color I'm going to mix is ultramarine blue and phthalo blue. Now, ultramarine blue is too warm, too reddish for the shadows, and phthalo blue by itself is too yellowish, too cool. So we need a combination of the two to just get the right blue for the mountain shadows. The two mixed together are a really lovely blue. I mean, you can buy this blue in a tube too, Indothrone blue and stuff, but it's not necessary. If you just mix those two together, you get a good one. I'm just going to scoop up this cerulean for now, because I won't need it for a minute. And I'm going to mix a more gray blue there. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to get the ultramarine and the phthalo, little less phthalo, and I'm going to make a gray by using the burnt sienna. I'm going to mix that with it to get a more gray color, because some of the shadows in the mountain are not as blue as the others. I have that green over here, and I'm mixing a bit of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna with that green, because some places in the mountain are kind and put them in. I can get them out again, because the lovely thing about cerulean blue is it washes out really easy. I've missed out, painted over up here somehow, or not even drawn in some mountains over there. Bad me. Now I'm going to get my darker blue mix, and coming down this side of the mountain is quite strong. So I can be a bit stronger with the brush strokes. And bring them down here. Like I say, you're going to have to work slowly and carefully when you get to this stage. Now, what I would like to do, because I made a mistake back here by not having my mountain, I'm going to actually use my water and Kleenex to find that mountain again. If I do that now, it will be dry by the time I want to go and do some modeling on it. I will have to go back to my other one and see if I forgot to draw it in on that one too. But this little brush I'm using is called an eradicator. It's specially designed to lift out paint to be small and fairly firm. Get that little mountain lifted out, it will be fine. And then go back to putting in the other darks on the mountain. And again, I want to be using a dry brush for a lot of it. I'm going to come, I want the blue. I tried the gray, that just then it was too gray. And come down this side. And add the tiniest bit of burnt sienna to it, tiny, tiny bit. There we go. It's sort of a gully here. And I've left a few of the lines. There's a sort of a squiggly line here. And of course, as it gets closer down the mountain, there's less bare mountain. Behind the tree. I'm going into, I have that greenish blue mix because it's getting closer to the tree line down here. I'm going to switch to the greenish blue. There's actually a field back there too that I'll fill in later with a little bit of beige. And I take a little bit of that greenish blue around here too. Of course, as the scenery comes towards you, you get to see a bit more of it, a bit more of the color and so forth. Little bit of the time, go slowly. Don't push yourself to go too fast with this. I want to get a little bit, I'm just picking up a touch of burnt sienna to get that blue a little bit more gray, because as I come down this side, it's quite dark on this side of the mountain back here. And I don't want to use a dry brush on this part because it's more in shadow, more solid, and especially as I come behind the roof of the barn here, I want to have a nice dark edge against the very, very light roof. And I had a bit of a line here. So what I want to have instead of a line is a more broken look. Because if you look at any of the photos, it's more broken up with trees, shrubs, rocks, all kinds of things happening in the background. And take a little bit of that pinky beige and that I mixed and just come down into this gully with a little bit of that violet sort of pinky beige color. And there is actually a bit more shadow coming down here, so I can put that in. If you start with the nice light dry brush strokes, you can go back and put in the darker details, which is much easier than trying to do them all at once. And then I have this area needs to be a little bit dry brush. I'll go back to the more blue mix. I'm going to add a little bit more blue to the blue mix here. Don't get it too phthalo. If you have too much phthalo, it'll be too bright. So be careful not to have too much phthalo blue in it. Don't want it too bright. And this side of the mountain is more, going to need more dry brush. It's a little bit too dark. Brush is not quite dry enough. Could have been a little bit drier, but we don't need to fiddle too much. I can put a bit more detail in when this layer is dry. And I'm going to put my smaller brush, get a little bit of the beige, and just add a little bit of the beige in here. And then a little bit more of the dark in places. Along the tip, it's a bit of a dark line along there. So I'm going to make sure I darken that up a little bit. And down here, I will do a bit more dark dry brush when this first layer is dry. Coming down here too. It's a little bit darker coming down here. I'm in the greeny blue mix now. Even down here can be a little bit darker. And in this field back here, sort of like a very light beige color. I have that light beige I've mixed up with the rose and the ultramarine, a little bit of raw sienna. Just put that little bit in there. So it's sort of a beigey violet color. And there's also a field of that color back here too. And the difference between the dilution, if you see the dilution here of that beigey color, I'll mix it again so you can see it was the ultramarine blue, a little touch of rose, make a sort of violet color, and then a little bit of the raw sienna. I'll find my raw sienna. A more touch of the blue. And then I'm going to dilute that down with some water so it's nice and light. Really, really light. And there's also back here in the distance, there's sort of a field that there's that light sort of lavender beige color. It's got a few trees in it too, which I'll put in after it's dry. And I have that lavender beige color on my brush. So what I could do is I could do some of this side of the mountain with it, especially up here. Now, if you want a little cloud on the mountain, you need to get clean water, which I'm just getting. I've got 2 pots of dirty water now, so I'm going to get a clean, some nice clean water. Putting my brush away properly, little brush. And to make that cloud on top of the mountain, I'm going to put a little bit of just clean water on here, because there's going to be some cloud just around the top of the mountain. And then teeny brush again, my little number 2 brush, and that beigey color, that beigey purple color I just mixed. And I'm going to see if I can put the tip of the mountain in and bring it down into that water that I just put on there. So the water will form a cloud that's hanging around the top of the mountain. I need to do a little bit more water. And then back into my beigey color. So what you're doing is you're painting into wet, so that some of the paper's dry and some of the paper's wet. And it will form a little cloud shape. Now, if you find that too tricky, just like leave that step out. Don't worry about it. I'm going to do a little bit more manipulation with my brush and bring a little bit of cloud over here too into the cerulean. And I need a lot more water with that color because this mountain is pretty light over here. I'm going to put the darker blue shadows on it later. And that color down. Up this side. And I'm going to have over on this side, I'm going to have a little bit of cloud at the top of this mountain too. So I'm just going to wet that side here. And it's kind of blue coming up into that bit there. And we've got some shadow up this side of the mountain coming up into the cloud. This one here needs a bit more work. Again, you can use your Kleenex to soften off that cloud shadow. And then going back to the beigey color. And coming back down. Now we've got a lot of blue shadow modeling to do on these distant mountains, but we'll do a lot of that when it's dry. It'll be a lot easier. And do a little tiny bit down this side while it's wet. And this area is very, very light, so I've just diluted it just a little bit more, dried my brush off, and just pulling a much lighter area down there. Have to fiddle with those little clouds a little bit to get them disappearing just properly into the cloud. I've got a little bit more ultramarine blue into my shadow mix. I just want to put a little bit more blue shadow mix coming down here. And then we'll do the rest of the shadow when this part's dried off. I'm going to stick with that beigey color because we've got all these very light mountains up here, and then we'll put all of this shadow on afterwards. Now I'm Oh, yeah, I'm just looking at what brush to use. I've got my number 4. I think I'll stick with my number 4. And I'll put that in here. Again, you can use a dry brush in some parts if you want to have just the white showing through for snow. Right, there's some snow up here. And there's a sort of snow lying in this part here. And make sure that I get a nice straight roof line here. And we'll put a bit of shadow to emphasize the roof line when the beige is dry. Brush, I might add a little bit in here. For some of these, they're not quite stark white. Add a little bit of that beigey color. And I still have some, my brush, this is very craggy up here. I'm going to add some of those crags with the, still the same beige color. Just adding a bit more paint over here. And I didn't get much of a cloud definition on the top here, so I'm going to have another go with that. Again, I still have the same beige color. It's just that when you come in with a second layer, you get a more definition of color, a little less water maybe. we have a very light plank here. So we're going to sort of aim to get those lights and darks and colors in there. I can keep mine zoomed in. I think that might be helpful for you. So I have some just cerulean blue mixed up over here, and I'm going to put that in just under the door here. Anytime I'm coming down to the bottom of this barn, I'm going to paint down as if I'm painting into the grass to get that grass texture at the bottom. And some of those, I know they put a filling between the planks of wood to fill in all of the air holes, and that's what's showing up, that light blue color. Some of the planks are sort of that blue gray. I'm going to put that into it. Doesn't matter if this mixes in wet and wet. And I want to try and remember to keep that one plank, this one plank, a very light gray, just for contrast and because it's there. And then I'm going to go to I have a mix here that was raw sienna and burnt sienna. I'm going to add a little burnt sienna to that. It's not quite deep enough. And I want to start with these horizontal planks here. Now remember, if your first layer is not dark enough, you can always go in with a second layer, but it's very hard to get a dark layer off once you've put the dark on. So start light and add dark if you need to. And the planks are horizontal, so make a horizontal brush stroke. I'm going to switch from time to time. I'm going to switch from I have my two browns here. I have my burnt sienna brown here, and I have my raw sienna and burnt sienna mix. I'm going to switch between them as I paint. I've just got my number 2 brush because I don't want all these planks to be the same color. They're not the same color. Some are more weathered, some are more orangey brown. So I've just switched to my pure burnt sienna at the moment. And then I'm going to go back to my other one that's a little bit darker. And I've even got a little bit of blue added to it now that was sitting in that palette on the edge. Added just a little bit of blue. And I know it's a bit shiny. It's very hard because I need the bright light for the camera, but I know it does reflect a little bit on the wet paint. I don't know what to do about that. Maybe buy a way more expensive light, probably, that doesn't go overhead. Now, as I come down to the grass here, instead of going horizontal, I'm going to pull my brush strokes down into the grass to form grass at the edge of the barn. And I'm going to try tipping it a little bit so it's not quite as shiny for you. Oh, there we go. And then as I get to the planks near the door, they are closer to a sort of a horizontal ground level. The grass kind of is shorter here, so I'm going to make sure that they flatten out when they get over here. And now the planks on the door, they come downwards. So I'm going to use the darker brown, the one that's got, it's here. It's got raw sienna, burnt sienna, and there's a little bit of blue down here that's making it just slightly dark. And I'm going to come down the door with those ones. Little brush again, number 2 brush. And there's not much grass at the bottom of the door, so I don't have to be too fiddly with making the grass there. And this, you can even see a bit of a doorstep there, so I can put that in. more horizontal. I'm going back to the burnt sienna, so that there's a difference between the door color and the logs color. Again, I'm tipping it so the light's not making it too shiny. And these logs just out the end of the house here, I'm putting those in with the burnt sienna. Put those out the end. Now the logs, the wood coming downwards is a much grayer brown. So this brown that I have here with the burnt sienna and the raw sienna, I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue to that to make it more of a gray brown. A little bit more of everything, a little bit more burnt sienna, a little bit more ultramarine blue, a little bit more raw sienna, a little bit more water. I don't want this one a really dark gray brown, just a gray brown that's going to be a little darker than the bottom of those. And those closest to the building on this side, they are much grayer and darker. So I'm going to do those first. You can actually see the round edge of the logs. And now I'm going to wash my brush and add a little bit of burnt sienna to the color I'm using so it's not as dark. And I got to remember there's that light plank in there that I want to leave quite light. I'm going to do a dry brush look. I'm tapping off my paint. I'm painting with a dry brush for these ones. This is going to be the light one there. I'm going back to the darker mix. I'm going to get that roof edge in. Actually going to bring it's going to help me to bring the roof edge down. It'll help me get those planks in line with the roof edge there. And continue putting them on. Going to my just burnt sienna for a minute, change the color up a little bit. And I know I'm not coming right down to the edge. I'm going to work on that as soon as I get those planks in. I got to have an edge here and bring that along. And then I can gently ease those planks down to the edge there. And at that point, I know there's a little bit more shadow under there. That looks, when the paint is wet and you're looking at it wet, it looks very, very dark. But you can see underneath here where it's dried, it really, really lightens up as it dries. So you will notice a big difference between the wet and the dry paint, but there's less of a difference as it dries up. And the top of the roof is quite dark too. So I'm going to take that, have that really dark mix over here, and I'm going to take my really thin liner brush. Remembering to put my brushes away, because it's going to be much easier for me to get a nice straight line. Hopefully, I'm going to turn it because pulling the line towards me is easier. I'm going to try and get a nice straight line down that edge of that roof by pulling that brush towards me. And same thing, when I've got this turned around, same thing coming down here. I think my mountain is dry enough that I can come down that edge. If it isn't, I'm in trouble, but it is. And while I have that brush in my hand and that color, I might as well do the other roof edge. Because I have to pull it towards me in the other direction. And who noticed that I splattered a big bunch of brown in my sky? Who knows when? Luckily, all these colors are non-staining. Oh, you didn't even see that. I did splat some brown, but they're non-staining, so most of them will wash off quite easily. Let's do all the roof edges. I've got that dark brown and my liner brush. And we can do that one. And do this one. And just along here too. If you don't have a liner brush, it's something you really need. They're just so great for getting thin lines. And this one is a 2/0. It costs me $5.80. I think it's not a big investment, but really, really useful. I'm just gonna, there's a line across the top of the barn here I'm going to put in as well. Now I'll be using my liner brush again. There's a lot of lines in this barn for sure, but that's my main ones I've put in. And don't lose my brush. Right, so we've got that side of the barn in. We might do a bit more shadow to that later, but we can go up now under the roof, or we can go over this side. We can go any way you like, really. Probably best to do this side because I'll blot my hand in it if I don't. And this is quite dark and quite orangey. So I will get my number two. I think the number 2 brush is best for all of this. And for the ones under the roof, I'm going to put, to start with, I've got that transparent orange, and I'm going to put a little bit of that on just to start with, just here and there where I can see some orange touches. The window, of course, is quite dark. We'll put that on after we've done this. And then I'm going to get that really dark brown that I mixed up with the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna, or you can use the dark brown, totally up to you. You don't have to use these colors. Remember, these are just suggestions. If you have something different in your palette, you go ahead and use it. That's fine. And then I'm going to do quite a dark brown for most of these ones under the roof. Sometimes it'll have a little bit more burnt sienna in, and sometimes a little less. Where I've put the orange in, I'll just kind of leave a little bit of it showing. And you don't really see much light between these planks. I'm still sort of doing them in that vertical motion because that's the way they are. And at least if I paint in that motion, it will work better than just sort of a blob of paint. And I'm leaving a little bit of that orange showing here and there. And I can put, when that's dry, it will lighten up considerably, and I can put a few more dark strokes on there. Now again, the planks at the front here have a real orange tinge to them. So I'm going to put a little bit of that orange on first. and use more burnt sienna on these, just burnt sienna. And I will come in with the dark brown later and put a little bit of dark brown detail on these. And I'm going to wait for that orange to dry a little bit too wet. I'll wait for that to dry up. And while I'm waiting for that orange to dry up, I'll put a bit over here. Now it's not like we see a lot of the orange, it's just there like underneath. Now I know that burnt sienna is quite an orange brown, but it doesn't quite do it for the brightness of this barn. And of course, coming down here again, we're going to come down into the grass and do that with the darker brown right now. Downward strokes with my brush into the grass at the bottom of the barn there. Right, I'm going back with just burnt sienna. This burnt sienna, I'm going back to this side, coming across and down into the grass. And the door comes downwards, and the door has a more raw sienna background to it. I'm getting just raw sienna on my brush right now, and I'm bringing that down vertically and again into the grass. And I'm remember over here, I had this brown over here that's raw sienna, burnt sienna, and a little bit of ultramarine to make it a bit more gray. Going back to that medium, so like a medium brown. And I'm going to do the barn door here with that medium brown. And again, as I come to the bottom, or you come to the bottom, go down with little strokes into the grass so that you have that grass texture. And now this orange should be ready to put the dark brown across. I'm just going to use burnt sienna just by itself for the rest of the ones across here. They're pretty orangey brown. And burnt sienna is a lovely orangey brown. And right at the end here, you can see the round logs at the right here, just putting that kind of round shape. Okay, so I can get a slightly bigger brush. All right, number 6. And a lot of this area is more raw sienna. So I have right here, I got my raw, this is my raw sienna. I'm going to put my underwash coming all the way down here on everything. No kind of big brush, no painting individual planks. Don't paint over your windows, go around them. Paint down into your grass. And at the bottom here, it's a little bit blue. So I'm getting my sky color, my cerulean blue, and I'm just dropping it in at the bottom into that raw sienna. This is an underpainting. It's going to be underneath the planks that we put on top. Again, I've got that cerulean blue on my brush. I'm going to paint a little bit across here like that for the underpainting, and a little bit of the orange just for an underpainting. At the top here, there's some wood that comes out. I'm going to use the orange just there. And while that underpainting is soaking in, oh look, I've got a great big bleed from over here. Doesn't really matter, because I'm going to come back with some dark brown in a minute. Just suck that up with a thirsty brush. So that needs to soak in before we come over with the darker brown. And we can do the light, very light gray at the side here. Now that's the mix we've almost forgotten about. In fact, we've forgotten about it for so long, it's dried up over here. That was the cerulean blue, the raw sienna, and a little tiny bit of the rose to make a very light gray. I've got to reactivate that with some water. Right up on me. Get my little number 2 brush. And we can leave a lot of the white showing on the paper. And it's dark under the roof, so we're going to put a darker shadow under the roof when this is dry. Don't worry about all the shadows we're going to put on later. I'm just at the moment just going to put the light gray, and we'll add some more color to that later. Might get a little tiny bit of raw sienna. A bit more of the light gray, and I just want to come down into the grass. Now I need to keep that very, very light, so it's mostly white paper showing through. And if you look at the picture, it's pretty light. It's sort of a little bit of sienna in some of the planks. The roof is very, very light too. And I'm sure your mountains are dry enough that you can put the roof on. So I've got that very light gray. And I'm just going to do a little bit of the, I think it's probably like no, it's wood. It's just very, very bleached old wood. So I'm going to, the planking is coming down the roof. I'm going to leave the piece across the top just white, and leave most of that roof just white. The only place I'm going to put a bit of a dark is along here, just along the ridge, roof cap ridge there, just there. And when this gray is dry, we'll just put a little bit more detail. I've got my very dark brown, very, very dark brown, and under the roof here, it sticks out in the front. It's very dark brown, so I'm just going to put that in. Well, I've got my little brush under that roof. I'm trying to think. This little window here is quite dark. I'll put that in. See, it's taking shape. It takes a while, but it's taking shape. There's going to be more. We're going to need to do more on this door with the planking with the dark brown, but I'll leave that for a minute. We've got the line across this roof here. And I will actually, there's no real line showing at the edge, but I want to put one in because sometimes with painting, you have to get a bit of a line in, otherwise it doesn't show up. And we're going to do a bit of dry brush again. Now I'm going to look for, I think a square brush would be best for this. I don't use them very often. I've got a square brush here. And the burnt sienna, I'm going to use these, see these mixes here. I've got my burnt sienna and raw sienna blue mix, a burnt sienna mix, and a dry brush. And I'm going to tap my brush on my towel. And I'm just going to I got to tap it a bit more. It's still got a bit too much paint on. I want to drag it across this roof. Still got a bit too much paint on. It's amazing, isn't it? The brush was dry. I've tapped the paint off. I'm just going to drag it across there for the sort of like shakes on the roof. And while this is, I'm gonna split it open. Split it open like this. Split the brush open. It's quite dry. I'm going to drag it across here too, and that will give a bit of the texture to the side of the barn. Even on the roof. Now I've got this brush nice and dry and split open like this. I'm actually going to drag it down the roof too and give myself a little bit of more color just on the roof. And the nice thing is if it's split open and it's dry, you don't get the color everywhere. You just get a little bit of color. And you don't want to overdo that because otherwise it's going to be too dark. You can, that's still a little wet. It's even a good technique if you've got the side of the barn here that's quite weathered. And I think it's dry enough. Yeah, I think so. I can add a little bit here too. No, it's not really dry enough. It's a bit too wet still. A bit too wet there. I'll leave that. Now we just got under here to do, so not much more to do. And under there, I'm going to go with an underwash of just burnt sienna. I think I'll use my number 8 brush. And while all these are drying up, we can go back and work on the mountains a bit more because I'm sure they are dry enough to work on them a bit more. So under the roof here, I'm just going to put an underwash of burnt sienna on there. And I'm going to come back with some dark brown when that's dry. I'm going to add the tiniest bit of orange to that transparent orange. And that's just a complete wash under there. We'll come back with the planking. And I'm drying that brush off, and I'm also going to just put a bit of dry brush here too. We'll come back and do that planking. Then while all that's sort of drying up a little bit, getting ready for the detail, we can work on the detail on these mountains. I bet you thought you'd done with the mountains, but we're not. Sorry about that. We got to go do a bit more work on them and get some of that just that blue shadow in on the mountains. I'm going to start with my bad boy over here that I made a mistake on. Going to swap my palettes out. I'm going to go back to the 2 blues that I have here, the Phthalo and the Ultramarine. And I want to get I'm going to get a Kleenex and lay, you know what, I got to be really careful. I'm very, very bad at getting my hand in the paint. So I'm going to turn my board so I don't get it in the paint that I just painted. And I want to have a little bit of shadow down this side here, quite sharp. And then very dry brush, I'm going to actually tap it on my Kleenex here. And just give a bit of, too dry, made it too dry. Give a bit of texture to this mountain back here. See, I'm sort of scrubbing with this brush. It's pretty dry, and I want to get that rocky texture on the mountains, but I want to get the edges quite dark. It's good to have just a Kleenex there to dab your brush on so that you get that dry brush. And you can see how I've already made a bit of shape to those mountains. I'm going to take a little bit of shape up there. There's my bigger brush. I also want to get a bit more shadow coming down this side towards the roof. Now, nothing I did on the roof was very wet. It was all dry brush, so we're not going to have a problem coming down there behind the roof. Yeah, that in. I think I'll zoom out just a little bit. You can see a bit more of what I'm doing. And then more dry. It's all got to be dry brush at this point. Coming down here, there is a lot of trees and stuff. And to kind of get a bit of texture in here. I'm not going to do every little tree, worry about stuff. Just trying to get a bit more shadow in. Okay, and down here. More of a tree line down here. So I'm sort of adding a little bit of a tree line. I'm running out of green, so I'm going to mix a bit more. I got the ultramarine blue, some azo yellow. I made my yellow messy now. A little bit of burnt sienna, just graze that green up a little bit. And back here between the fields and up near the mountains, you can see a little bit more of the tree line. It's a bit more distinct. And over the other side too, just along here, there's a bit more of a tree line, something going on here. And at the bottom of the mountain here, somehow I've got a big blob of water there. And as they go up the mountain, they get more blue. So I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue to that mix. I didn't keep bringing it over my painting because I keep splattering it with my mixing. Right, so we're coming up the mountain here, and I added a bit more blue to that mix, dry my brush off a bit, and there's sort of a tree line gradually coming up the mountain here, but it's not as distinct as that lower tree line down here. I'm being impressionistic with it. I'm not doing every tree. I'm not making it as obvious as it is in the photo. And down here too. I just want to get the colors in, the values and the colors in, but being a bit impressionistic with the shapes. Which is the wonderful thing about painting. You don't have to be super realistic unless you want to be. If you want to be, I mean, that's great. So you can see as I'm kind of building up the extra layer of shadow, it's giving that impression of the shapes on the mountain. And then I'm going back to these middle mountains. And again, I'm going to turn it a bit just because it's easier for me to work, not get my hand in everything. Going back to my blue, which is the ultramarine blue and phthalo blue mix to get some of the shadows on these mountains here, just to give them a kind of an edge. They come down. And if your edge is too sharp, I'm using a wet brush, and I'm just going to use a wet brush to soften that just a little bit so it's not too sharp. And I want a little bit of shadow behind the roof, and there is shadow on the mountain behind the roof. Make the roof stand out a little bit more. And the sort of crags in the mountain. Dry my brush off a bit more and just scrape my brush. I know it's not very good for your brush, actually, just scrape it like this. I'm being pretty gentle. I'm just sort of scraping it over the mountain there to get that little bit of texture. And up here, it's a little darker. A bit more shadow. Oops, no, there's not any shadow where I just put my brush. It's up here. It's much, much darker. And again, I've got my wet brush because I want to just drag that hard edge down and soften it a little bit. And again, I want the dry brush. When you're painting mountains, the dry brush is really what you need to be using anytime you have this type of cragginess that you want to convey. See, if I like really scrub with that dry brush, I can get that craggy look. I could probably use, I'm using my number 2, just stressing the poor little guy out a bit. I could probably move to my number 4 and still get a better effect. Dry it off a little bit. And quite a bit of dry brush needed down here. It doesn't matter if it's not exactly like the photo, as long as you get that kind of look. And I don't know if you can hear, and you probably can't hear like scrubbing of my poor brush on the paper. I don't very often abuse my brushes, and I could probably use a cheaper brush, but I don't quite know how it would react. So I don't want to use something I haven't experienced or tried out. Every so often, I'm going to a much wetter paint right now. I want the shadows a little bit deeper, a bit darker, a bit more of them. So I'm going to a much wetter paint, not dry brush, coming down this edge. And of course, as my paintbrush runs out of paint as I'm coming down that edge, it's a great time to then use it for a dry brush again as it runs out of paint. It's getting very, I'm actually running out of paint in my paint well now. I grabbed a bit of the green and then put a bit of blue with it. Tap it on my sponge. And I think we can finish up this area with that greeny blue. Tappity tap, tap off the paint. You see how I went from like the beige to the dry brush, and now going a little bit darker. As the dry brush dries, I can put in a little bit more dark detail. Blue. Also over here, there's some shadow. I'm going to put that bit of shadow in. Shadow up the mountain. Coming up to that cloud. A little bit of shadow down this side. A little bit on the top. A little bit here. This one is, I'm doing like a more wet. It's not as, it's a softer shadow, not as craggy. And it's almost, oh, we're almost done. Just, I think there's a little, oops, a bit too wet. Sometimes your brush is a bit too wet. And I just want a little bit more, it could go a little bit wet, a little bit more shadow coming down here. A little more on this. I could go a bit wetter, actually, it's all right. And then all we need to do is finish off some details on the barn. Oh, whew, it's a marathon, isn't it? I'll let you catch up a little bit, give you a couple of minutes to catch up. Yeah, I know this is a lot of detail, I know, to get done in one session. We don't have a lot more to do. A few little things. Need to put a few more sort of brown details on the barn. A little bit of dark in the window, and a little bit more detail on the foreground. I'm going to take my number 8 brush, a bigger brush, and I have that bluey green. Like I made a couple of bluey green colors here. I've got the blue for the mountain shadows and the bluey green for the lower mountains. So I'm going to take that, put the two together. I don't want it too dark, but what I do want to get is some of that foreground shadow that comes across here. Now I've got my number 8 brush, and I want to do some really just big strokes to get those shadows in. I don't want to be fussing with these strokes. So they come out across here, there's a little bit here, a little bit here coming in, a bit here. And I've got a fuzzy brush here. Don't use this fuzzy brush very often. It's called a filbert grainer. I'm going to have a little go with that, with this greeny blue color. And what I'm going to try doing, it works quite well, is I want some shadowy grass. It's in the photo, just sort of here and here. There's some darker shadow on the grass here. I'm just going to use that little brush that I bought. Of course, you can use any type of a brush. I would normally probably just use my very thin brush. Try this thing out. And just a little bit of shadow. It's in the photo along this edge here. And while I got this funny little brush in my hand, I'm going to get some burnt sienna. And again, you can use, this is my liner brush. So I show you, I'll do the same color and show you that you can use a liner brush too. I can just flick the grass up with that liner brush and like here. That's what I would normally use. I don't usually buy fancy brushes to do stuff. I was just curious about this fuzzy little guy. And so I'm going to get some burnt sienna on it. And I'm going to try doing some of that grass with this grainer, it's called. It's a little bit, I guess you get used to manipulating it. I'm not used to manipulating it yet. Just want to put a bit more burnt sienna in some of that grass and around here. Here. The reason I don't use these sort of fancy brushes very often is they do give you a very regular pattern that I try and avoid. But this one, it's not too regular. The hairs on it are not as regular as some brushes, so it's kind of nice. It's quick and easy and down and dirty for getting just a bit of dry grass in. And this is just burnt sienna on it right now, so I'm just adding a bit of texture to the grass. That's my liner brush. I got that bluey green, and I'm just adding a bit more of sort of bluey green here and there. There's a kind of a shadow at the end of the barn here. I think I'll put in while I've got that brush in my hand. I'm going to use my liner brush just to put a few more streaks of dry grass here and there. And actually the shadow on the corner was not really dark enough. I'm just going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue and just darken that up a little bit. Now we need, the window is very, very dark. Of course, what I've done is put all my brushes on my table instead of in my brush holder. And then I lose them. Right, let's go back to my number 2 brush and put the very dark window in. So I have this burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And if I mix it up nice and thick with very little water, see how dark that is? Very thick, very little water, and I'm going to put that dark window in first. And a little bit more dark in this one too. That one's quite dark. And I now have to put some darker brown. This is dry enough, I think, to put some darker brown up there. So bring this back again. Remember, I just mixed up that very black color with just those two colors still, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And I can just mix a dark brown with them that's not as dark as that black I mixed. So more water, more burnt sienna in the mix. And I'm going to get a nice dark brown to put some of the detail in, especially some of these planks here. We can put the darker brown in, and sometimes you may need to add a little bit. I've got to add a little bit more water to my mix. It's a little bit too dark for some of them. I'm going to just add a bit of water to it and lighten it up. At the top of the barn, of course, under the roof, it's pretty dark. So I can go to my darker brown. There is I think there was a door here. Maybe there's some kind of an opening just along there. And where that door is a bit lighter. So I'm going to my burnt sienna with a little bit of that. What I've got over here is my burnt sienna, adding a little bit of that dark brown into it, so it's not as dark as the one I just used to do the planking on the door. Add a bit more water. And then, of course, there's the planking that goes across. And I'm using a more burnt sienna mix for these ones. And the top of this sort of door here is quite dark. Put the kind of line around the door. Go to my slightly light. than they do look when they're dry. And even on this roof where we put that kind of dry brush texture, I'm going to add a little bit more texture to the sort of shingles that are on there. And then we have to, unfortunately, we have to do all of this like planking with the liner brush, or a thin brush at least, and your dark brown mix. I have to keep dipping in because the brush is so thin, it doesn't hold much paint. So I have to keep loading it so I've got enough paint to paint the planks. I'm going a little bit fast now because we're sort of running out of time. So what I would do normally at this point in my normal sort of painting day would be to go away for a couple of hours, is what I would do at this point, and let everything really dry thoroughly before putting on a lot of this detail. A lot of this finishing detail is best done on really, really dry paper. And when you've had a little bit of time to go away and have a break from your painting, and then come back and assess it a little bit, assess where you need a bit more detail, where you need a bit more dark. When you get this close for 2 or 3 hours to a painting, you don't really see it anymore. You get much too involved in the minutiae of it, the little details, seeing it up too close, and you don't really see the whole thing. But as we have to sort of get finished on time, or close to on time, I will zoom ahead and do what I wouldn't normally do, and that is try and get some of these details on now before it's thoroughly dry. And quite often after the lesson is finished, I will come back the next day and do a bit more and a bit more detail, a bit more fixing of things. It's I mean, it's just the way it is. You can't work on something for too long when the paint's wet. But if it was nice and dry, this is what I would be doing. I'd be putting in all these little details, all these little shadows, all these little finishing touches. Make sure you get some edges around windows and doors and places. Even this one, and this, I'm going to put a little bit more brown. This has quite a bit of dark at the top of this, a bit dark here. Quite a few places that you will notice are a bit darker when the paint dries, that you need to get a bit more dark in there. But, and I'll zoom out because it looks terrible zoomed up close. You can see way too much detail. You're not supposed to see that close up. So what I'd probably do when this part's dry, I would give a bit of dry brush in burnt sienna to give it a little bit more brown on the barn, a little bit more dark definition. The darks don't stand out when the paper's damp. They just kind of get absorbed into the damp paper. So you really need to have beautifully dry paper to get some of your darks to stand out. What I might do is I might do a bit more dry brush in the grass. I think around here, I could do a bit more. I look at my original, well, it's not too much of my original, but I could do a little bit more dry brush here for grass. It's a bit empty and open, but you get the idea. We're just about finished. It just needs a little bit of time. And also some of this mountain up here could be a little bit darker. I've got my ultramarine blue, and I just feel like we need a bit more shadow up here. The clouds are making shadow on these mountains too. And they're making shadow down the side of this mountain quite strong. So there's little things like that that I would do a bit more work on after it starts to dry. Get a little bit more shadow down here. You see where I forgot that mountain at the beginning? It doesn't, you wouldn't really know that I forgot it. It's come up okay. Maybe a little bit darker than the other mountains. That's okay. Nobody, if you weren't watching me make that mistake, nobody would know. A bit more detail. So you can see me, look, I'm just going on and on. I just can see that I can add a little bit more here, a little bit more there. But for the most part, it's kind of done and finished and just about there. There are little things like you could, if you wanted, when the roof is dry, you could add a little bit more. Want to thin a brush. Got the dark brown. You could add a little bit more to the roof detail if you wanted, here and there. Not too much because you'll lose that lightness of the roof. But if you wanted, you could just add a little bit more. Especially closer. When you get closer, always you can add a bit more detail, a bit more color. Over here, there's some of these shadows are quite dark between the planks. You can add a little bit more. There are under the roof, there are some planks of wood that come out. You can add those little details. And so it goes on. At some point you have to say, right, I'm done, good enough.
Well, thank you for painting along with me, and I hope your painting went well. I'd just like to remind you, if you're watching this on YouTube, I looked and 90% of you that watch my videos haven't subscribed, it tells me. So please think about subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything and it helps me. I provide all of these videos for free and I put a lot of work into them. So please just, show some appreciation and hit that subscribe button. I'm also going to be providing my sheets of instructions and line drawings on Etsy pretty soon. So I will be putting links to that on my Facebook page, which is Watercolours with Caroline, and on my links here on my videos. So thanks again for joining me. See you next week. Bye for now.